Hi everyone, this is going to be a video about fighting poverty. So we're going to spend some time talking about the TANF program. TANF, of course, stands for Temporary Assistance to Needy Family. Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. But it wasn't always known as TANF. It became known as TANF in 1996 when Bill Clinton passed what was known as the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Prior to signing that, he'd promised, was one of his campaign promises, was to sort of end welfare as we know it. And what he did was replace AFDC with TANF, and AFDC stood for Aid to Families with Dependent Children. We can just by sort of looking at the name of the act that that sort of instituted TANF, we can start to get a feel for what some of the values were that were associated with the TANF program. I mean, the significant words in the name of the act obviously are personal responsibility and work opportunity. So we see the emphasis on sort of the individual for alleviating their position of poverty, and then we also see sort of this elevation of the importance of work. So let's spend a few minutes talking about this. Under AFDC, beneficiaries were consistently women and children. AFDC had been sort of a long-standing program, and it was pretty highly stigmatized to be on the program. Ronald Reagan, in the decade before the 90s, had made some comments about welfare mothers and was sort of preoccupied with this idea of dependency. And much of his comments, much of Reagan's comments, served to sort of politicize poverty and feminize it as well, which was kind of problematic, because the beneficiaries were sort of the poorest of the poor, and because the beneficiaries were primarily women and children, what it really meant was that the poorest of the poor were most often women and children. Now, the other thing we should mention real quick is that AFDC was run through sort of a federal-state partnership, and that left states with sort of a significant influence on the shape and sort of regulatory nature of the program. But TANF was going to change that, and so among all of the different things that we see here, sort of thematically, are this idea of work and, obviously personal responsibility, but we also see this sort of need to balance states' rights with the role of the federal government here. So there's sort of all of the issues that we've talked about this semester are sort of present in the TANF transition from AFDC. One of sort of the unfortunate legacies of TANF is that it's really sort of built in and solidified this sort of structural oppression. TANF obviously is a means-tested program, and so what it's done is sort of solidify the sort of assessment of deserving poor from undeserving poor. And of course, these are ideas that we've talked about a couple of different points this semester. But the question obviously is, what happens to the undeserving poor, right? They often become the most marginalized then. The other sort of unfortunate legacy of TANF was that it sort of separated programs used by men and used by whites from those used by women and people of color. So TANF actually sort of exacerbated sort of racial inequality in the country. And then, of course, the other thing it did was sort of exacerbate the idea of gender inequality as well. because it so heavily stigmatized women and caregivers and especially women with children on the program. So one of the ways it did that was TANF obviously was sort of Clinton's big push was to make it sort of a temporary program, to put sort of time limits on the length of time that people could sort of derive, or receive benefits. And certainly it worked in some cases, but it didn't work in a lot of cases, particularly when the woman in question was a caregiver and had responsibilities for caregiving that would sort of extend beyond the time limit that the 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act sort of instituted. One of the ways we can sort of characterize this conflict is this idea that's listed here in this last bullet point, which is sort of a social insurance versus a welfare program. A social insurance program is sort of this idea of a safety net, right? This idea that there's something there to catch a person if they fall on hard times. Welfare, on the other hand, is this idea that people are going to sort of be dependent and sort of persist and subsist on aid from the government. And so TANF really moved, it was an attempt to move from really a form of welfare to a form of social insurance, but because it so heavily stigmatized women, and because it sort of systematically separated programs used by men and whites from women and people of color, and because it sort of had this, this built-in deserving and undeserving poor, what it really did was sort of institutionalize oppression. And TANF really has kind of a not so great legacy. So as I said a couple of slides ago, let me say it this way: the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act really emphasized the importance of work. And so welfare, as we know it, sort of ended, and it became sort of replaced with this thing called workfare. There was this presupposition that there are jobs available for anyone who looks, and really the idea is just that you need to look. And so the other thing that TANF sort of helped create was, I don't want to say a pipeline, but a support system for people to go and find jobs. This was, of course, during a time of sort of immense globalization and offshoring of jobs. The 90s were sort of the height of that. And so jobs weren't always available for people, and that kind of became a problem, because they might have been looking for jobs, but were they not available, their benefits still ran out. And that's sort of one of the ways that TANF sort of structuralized or institutionalized oppression and inequality as well. And then, of course, the other thing it did, which is mentioned in the first bullet point here on the slide, was it really shifted the concept from, it shifted the concept of public assistance from sort of a right of citizenship to this idea that it was temporary, and the qualifications were pretty severe. You had to have fallen on pretty hard times in order to even qualify for it. So that, again, when I said on the previous slide, there was this shift from sort of a social insurance to a welfare. From a welfare to a social insurance kind of a thing. That the bar was set. The bar for qualifying was set at such severe standards that's what helped sort of institutionalize these positions of inequality. So from a historical perspective, welfare was, the provision of relief associated with poverty was typically done through volunteer groups and organizations. Very early in the semester, we talked about this idea of outdoor relief, and that people would work often on farms or sort of public works programs in exchange for the aid or the temporary assistance that they were seeing or they were receiving. Outdoor relief was really not popular. It was hard to fund. It was hard, the people who were sort of supposed to participate in outdoor relief weren't always able-bodied or sort of able to participate in it and that kind of thing. The point of this is that there's always been sort of a certain segment of the population that has really not benefited from sort of urbanization and industrialization, has really been sort of at the margins of society and really been marginalized by all of these immense social forces that we see, like urbanization and industrialization and things like that. And oftentimes those people were children who were abandoned by their families, and would have been abandoned for any one of 100 reasons. They were widows. They were people with disabilities, whether those disabilities were intellectual or developmental or physical or something like that. They were people who had addictions, for example. So there were just a huge number of circumstances that sort of could drive someone to this state of poverty. And for some people it was temporary, but for a lot of people, for example, women, for people with, for example, people with disabilities or people with substance abuse problems, poverty was a pretty persistent, state. So the state of Kansas was sort of the first to institutionalize some kind of government-run social insurance program. That was in 1908, as the slide says here. Later on, there was a White House conference for children that sort of helped create this thing called mothers' pensions, and that would have been support for women who were responsible for raising children, and particularly for women who were widowed. This was another one of the sort of the earliest efforts at sort of a state-run or governmental-run social insurance program. During the Great Depression, the mothers' pensions program was simply not enough. They weren't paying sort of a subsisting amount of benefits. That was replaced with ADC, which was Aid to Dependent Children, and then that was replaced with AFDC, which actually lasted for decades and decades. Of course, AFDC, as I said before, was Aid to Families with Dependent Children. Interestingly, there are some sort of value statements in the name of AFDC as well, and it's interesting to sort of think about how these value statements have existed, throughout the history of the United States. Sort of the designers of the AFDC program never really envisioned the concept of an unwed mother as a primary recipient of the program. I mean, their ideas of family were probably typical for the time, but did not foresee sort of the great social changes that were on the horizons in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And even in the 80s and, in 90s and until Clinton sort of, remade the program in 96. Certainly AFDC was a program that you had to qualify for. And so we still see themes of deserving and undeserving present in AFDC throughout its history. My thought is that the sort of architects of AFDC had intended for other people to come in and work on it, for lawmakers in the future to sort of revisit it from time to time and update it. I don't know that we can blame them for not having the foresight. Like I said, I think their ideas of what constituted a family and who would be sort of a typical recipient were probably simply a product of the times. At any rate, that's not really all that important. What's important is sort of that this idea of undeserving is been part of the program really since its inception. So strategies for reforming AFDC over the decades included things like social service strategies, these institutional strategies, these job creation, subsidization strategies, these child support strategies. Social services at one point would have come in and provided support for people and for families. Institutional strategies would have helped, organizations build capacity to support these kinds of things. Human capital strategies would have been ways to increase human capital. And actually, capital is spelled wrong on that slide. It should be capital with an A-L, C-A-P-I-T-A-L. I'll have to fix that. But human capital would be, say, education or job training or sort of specific kind of training to help someone land, some kind of a job. The government tried creating jobs on its own or incentivizing, the public sector, the private sector to create jobs. And then when the last thing they tried was sort of ways to support children, things like Head Start and helping people sort of have healthy childhoods and things like that. But no matter what happened, there were sort of always poor people and always people who were in poverty. And so this idea that, poverty is sort of a persistent problem in the U.S. emerges. This idea that there's perhaps a culture of poverty, that it sort of explains why people stay, or why generations of people stay poor, is sort of born. So the big changes from AFDC, as AFDC morphed into TANF, included work requirements, and certainly, the looking for work requirement, and included some education requirements, and then time limits. It included a provision that parents, particularly fathers, had to support their children. And so one of the things that happens now with TANF is that if a man is, or any person really, but often this is a man, if a man is ever declared eligible for benefits, there's a search to see if he owes or they owe child support. And if they do, that money is garnished and it's sent to the caregiver of the child. There also are limitations for immigrants. So it's actually just about impossible for someone with an immigration status to get onto TANF. It has to be there has to be this sort of citizenship requirement. So it's interesting the way that things have been sort of politicized, and there's concern today over undocumented immigrants accessing benefits, but the reality of it is that they don't qualify for benefits. You have to be a citizen in order to qualify for TANF. So, in terms of the social analysis of TANF, there's really sort of two issues at the heart of public assistance. How do we help children? How do we sort of have evaluated children to be deserving poor, right? They're often poor or vulnerable through no fault of their own. And we've really done an admirable job at reducing child poverty, and that's simply by providing cash and benefits to poor children and their caregivers. On the other hand, the other sort of big issue here is really adult dependency. And the dependency piece has been, we attempted to resolve it by putting on these time limits and these work requirements and these education requirements and things like that. But the reality of it is that we don't expect the same things from children. And so there really is this contradiction. That's what that last bullet point says. It says, how do we resolve the contradiction? There really is a sort of contradiction between children who are TANF recipients, who are sort of gifted or given benefits in cash, and don't have the same requirements that adults do. Now, the argument can be made, and it's a valid argument, that we can't expect children to work or look for work, right? They don't have the same sort of capabilities, and they're not at sort of the same point in their life as adults are. But we've been so successful at reducing child poverty simply by distributing cash and benefits. We've been much less successful at reducing adult poverty, primarily because we've been preoccupied by this idea of dependency. So the ways to think about the social impact of things like TANF is really, in, like I said a couple of slides ago, the extent to which it's sort of institutionalized certain forms of poverty. To be on TANF is to be horribly stereotyped. You can think about sort of the characteristics of typical recipients in your state. That information often is available on the internet, and it's worth sort of looking for. The reality is that about 1.4% of the U.S. population receives benefits. Now, this is some older data on this slide, but it doesn't change very much. So, to give you some perspective, there's like 330 million Americans, and so 1.4 is 1.4% of 330 million is pretty small. That is very much in conflict with the assumption that the size of the program is growing, and that the budget is sort of headed to this place where it's out of control. That's simply not the case, and part of that is because caseloads are small because of the time limit, because of the ability to receive benefits is time limited. But the reality is that the program is much smaller than sort of that public perception would suggest that it is. Benefits are pretty small. The average is $392 a month. The average in 2010 was $392 a month. It doesn't change an awful lot because the federal poverty guideline doesn't change an awful lot, and actually with inflation, that number doesn't buy a whole lot relative to the increasing value of the dollar. I won't say. Well, let me say a couple things about sort of race. Race, there were no big changes in sort of the racial composition of recipients between AFDC and TANF. About 70%, a little less, are members of a minority group, though. This family size issue was sort of a big concern about AFDC, and one of the things that Ronald Reagan did to sort of galvanize public distaste for AFDC was proclaim that people had children. They had more and more children to derive more and more benefit, and that simply wasn't the case. Family size is no different between a family that gets TANF and a family that doesn't. It's not significantly different. The average age of mothers is pretty young. It's 30. Most of them have never finished high school, so they're fairly their education level is fairly low. But the reality of it is that this is a complex program, and although there's only 1 point something percent of people who are on it, there's still a huge diversity of people who do derive benefits. And so we get to this thing called the onion metaphor. And if you think about what an onion is, what happens as you peel back the layers, there's more and more there. And the same can be said about TANF recipients, that it's a complex issue. There's a lot of layers to it. And as you peel things back, as you peel those layers back, you discover more and more things. What this really is to say is that poverty is a complex issue that doesn't have sort of a single causality, or a single factor that causes it. And what that means is that there's no one way to resolve poverty, because it's a multifaceted problem. It's going to require a multifaceted approach. More on that in a second here. But let's talk about time limits real quick. So the big TANF requirements, no more than 60 months, which is 5 years in the course of a lifetime, and then no more than 2 years at a time. So if someone did receive TANF for 2 years, they'd have to, there's the possibility they could get it again, but there would have to be a period of employment between those sort of 2-year stints. There are some exceptions and some extensions that they really vary by state. Some states are a little bit more generous or permissive, and obviously some states less generous, things like that. So one of the big issues, I said a second ago, we were going to sort of revisit this idea of poverty and why it's so complex and why it's so difficult to solve. And we get a sense of some of the complexity of the issues when we start to think about the values of sort of the policy that informed TANF. So we view the U.S. as the land of opportunity, right? This pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of rugged individualism. There's a strong tradition of the nuclear family, which has eroded, for better or for worse, over the past couple of decades. Our country has sort of always valued hard work and this idea that you sort of control your destiny through how hard you work and things like that. And so when we proclaim these values as solutions to poverty, we frankly can see that we weren't successful at alleviating poverty, and that's because poverty is far more complex than simply the breakdown of a traditional nuclear family, or this idea of individual responsibility. There frankly are big structural reasons for poverty that have to do with economic choices and political choices. The sort of institutionalization of some of these values in TANF in the 90s was viewed, Clinton, this was judged to be a success, and Clinton was sort of widely regarded as a successful reformer of TANF. But the reality of it is, like we said a couple of slides ago, is that there's been this huge sort of institutionalization of stigma and inequality, and yet, and poverty continues to persist for certain segments of the population. There is sort of course, this other concern that TANF is a substantial portion of the federal budget. It's not. It's a couple of percentage points. This is aged data. This is from 2011, but it hasn't increased substantially. It doesn't contribute to deficits at either the federal or state level, and we've actually decreased the amount of spending, amount of TANF spending since 2002. That would have changed a little bit, I think, in the Great Recession years of 2008, 2009, and 2010. But I believe that it's, as a percentage of the federal budget, it's actually the amount we're spending is actually declining now in 2016, 2017, 2018, that kind of thing. By emphasizing this idea of work, the point of TANF was to incentivize work, not disincentivize it. Disincentivize it. That's why the program sort of forces participation in the labor market. There also was this concern about family structure and unwed births, and that's why benefits were capped on family size, based on family size as well. So if we want to sort of determine the economic impact of TANF, we have to sort of come up with some agreement about what constitutes success and what kinds of things we want to know. There is probably a difference in what's judged to be successful, whether, based on political orientation, based on whether a person is a politician or an economist or a social worker, or maybe even what level of government they work at. But let's look at just a couple of the outcomes real quick. So there was about a 60% decrease in the size of the program from a participant perspective between 96 and 2009. 60% of those people who left the program got a job, which was good, but 40% did not. So what happened to those 40%? As we've said sort of throughout this presentation, they were likely the poorest of the poor, and sort of the most marginalized, the most unable to participate in the workforce on the terms that other people participate on. And we don't know much about this group of people, and that's a problem. We also don't know much about the impact of children who might be dependent on some of the people who left the program as well. So, has child poverty increased or decreased? These are sort of questions that we have to ask. I want to just sort of conclude by talking about some of the values again. Remember, one of the ways we think about policy really is sort of in the values that it espouses. And so we've talked about a number of the values of TANF and the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996. And that's an important part of how the program is shaped or was shaped. So our national values play a key part in sort of the development and then the delivery of poverty. Okay, thank you for watching.